Monday, August 9th, 2020, and we are live. We are here with a fantastic brother, my friend and historian, Professor Manu Ampim. Hotep, brother, how you doing today?
Hotep, brother Michael. I'm doing great, brother. Glad to be with you.
Absolutely, absolutely, man. Well, I've interviewed you a few times throughout the years. You've spoken here in Detroit. You and Sister Nubia Wardford here in Detroit, and I've been sharing the interviews you've done the past couple of Sundays with Mukasa Dada, Willie Ricks, who was a member of SNCC and worked with Stokely, Carmichael, Kwame, Toure, brilliant brother. And, you know, as I was talking to you last Sunday, I talked to Dr. Leonard Jeffries, interviewed Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, and I was talking to you as well about SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, about Kwame Toure, Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement, all this stuff. And you were dropping some stuff on me, man. I said, look, I said, I got to bring you back on my show to talk about this, man. So, a lot of this precipitated by a few things. The passing of John Lewis, okay, who's one of the co-founders of SNCC, passing of John Lewis. Comments from Bill Clinton at John Lewis's funeral, where Bill Clinton said there were 2 or 3 years there where the movement went a little too far towards Stokely, but in the end, John Lewis prevailed. And you were talking about how Black Power was the next logical step in the civil rights movement, things like this. So give us an overview of what it was that you were sharing.
Yeah, so SNCC was the premier student organization in the 60s. SNCC was founded at a conference at Shaw University in April of 1960.
Right.
And it was centered around the student sit-ins. But, the SNCC work expanded beyond that, and it became a frontal attack on white supremacy and the Jim Crow system all the way around. And after years and years of struggle, finally, after Black folks were beaten and bombed and murdered and killed all across the South as they were struggling to break down the system of Jim Crow, eventually the Civil Rights Bill was passed in '64, and the Voting Rights Bill was passed in 1965. But by that time in Alabama, the SNCC was organized. They helped to organize the local organization, the County Freedom Organization, and the Lowndes County Organization. They chose the Black Panther as its symbol, and that was a response to the White Democratic Party, where they had white supremacy. They had a rooster,
right?
White supremacy for the right. So it made all the sense in the world that the Lowndes County Freedom Organization chose the Black Panther, and then the slogan for SNCC activists was Black Power for Black People. And eventually, Brother Mukasa Dada, he shortened it from Black Power for Black People to Black Power. And so the Black Power movement was a logical outgrowth of the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, after 1965, when the Voting Rights Bill was actually passed, and for many, the civil rights movement was over. And in fact, Dr. King's organization stopped focusing on civil rights. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference started focusing on acquiring power. Now, Dr. King wasn't a great fan of the phrase Black Power. He said, in talking about a slogan, we need to organize programs to organize power. And so
exactly.
Activists and the core activists, they were shouting and promoting Black Power as of June 1966 is when that became the dominant slogan in the movement. No longer freedom now, but it was Black Power. And this became a slogan, this became a rallying cry. And you see the Black Power movement that burst on the scene in 1966. And it was a whole decade of struggle where Black folks saw that there was little gains that had been made over this period for civil rights, but the civil rights focus became less and less of a area of concern for activists that continued to be relevant in the struggle. So the Black Power movement was a logical outcome. And not only that, but brother, to call that era the civil rights movement is a misrepresentation, because there were organizations and individuals that had always been calling for human rights and not simply civil rights. Human rights are rights that people are born with. No one gives you human rights. They may try to take them away. The right to life, the right to to be free. Those are human rights that no white supremacist or anybody else can give you. They can certainly try to take them away. So there had always been a human rights focus, but it became dominant after 1965. And the SNCC activists and core activists were the under Ford McKissick. They were the ones leading that campaign. So it was a logical outgrowth because what they had been dealing with the whole time is white power. And so it was a response to, you know what, we need black power. So this is one of the most important aspects of the movement. And sure, Bill Clinton made crazy statements, but Jim Clyburn, who was a young activist, he was the one talking negative. Jim Clyburn said, James Clyburn, the
Representative James Clyburn from South Carolina.
Yes,
he's the House Majority Whip.
Yes. House Majority Whip. James Clyburn said on multiple occasions, CNN interviews, that Stokely and Mukasa and others, quote unquote, destroyed our movement when they started to embrace black power. So he's misrepresented the history. They destroyed the movement. SNCC had already had ideological differences the whole time. So you had like the nonviolent action group in Washington D.C. with Charles Cobb and Stokely Carmichael and others. They never embraced nonviolence as a way of life. They thought it was an important tactic. If anything, you're outgunned, you're going to have to think strategically rather than getting out to come out, we're going to shoot down the police.
So you just mentioned Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr., right?
Yes.
SNCC, and here's his book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. Okay. And when I talked about this at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History during the Dr. King Day celebration, people tensed up and they didn't invite me back to speak at another Dr. King Day celebration because I said the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement. If it had not been for Negroes with guns, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement. Then I showed this book. I had it up on the big screen. This book here about the Deacons for Defense and Justice. I said, you trying to tell me the Deacons for Defense and Justice were not part of the civil rights movement? They were protecting civil rights workers like with CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. But they get left out this whole nuance. And this is, you and I talked on the phone last Sunday about this. I talked about this with Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries of Ohio State University. He wrote this opinion piece for the Washington Post. Stokely Carmichael didn't deserve Bill Clinton's swipe during John Lewis's funeral. But this whole transition, it's a logical transition from quote unquote the civil rights movement especially after the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we know August 6th, it was the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. The next logical step is the Black Power ideology. And just very quickly here, when we look at the article from Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, he talked about Black Power was an approach to change. It was an approach to change rooted in Black political independence, economic empowerment, and cultural pride that gained popularity during the late 1960s. Okay, so talk about this, and Dr. King shying away from the slogan Black Power, but embracing the overall concept.
Oh yeah,
because he said power has no color. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, he also said power is not the white man's birthright. It's not going to be organized for us in neat government packages. It's an entity that anybody can organize under its own auspices, and that's what we need, Black Power. So people should read what Dr. King actually had to say. Matter of fact, his most extensive focus on Black Power, he has in chapter 2 of his book, Where Do We Go From Here?
That's it?
That's it. That's the last book.
Where do we go from here? Chaos and Community. Go ahead.
That's chapter 2. And not only that, he wrote an extensive essay. He wrote an extensive essay called Black Power Defined. Dr. King is giving details of how to organize Black Power in the labor arena, the political arena, the social arena, giving specific details. One of his criticisms is that you got to be willing to calculate how an extreme right-wing majority would not hesitate to exterminate every Black man, woman, and child. This is what he was concerned about, is how the media would use the slogan of Black Power. Plus, his criticism was that you guys are talking about a slogan, but where's the programs? Because earlier in the 60s, they had programs that they were organizing around and campaigns. They always called them campaigns that they were organizing around. So Dr. King definitely embraced Black Power as a program, and he said it had to be practical, and people had to be practical. So most of what has been presented is a gross misrepresentation, because not only does Black Power have a foundation long before it emerged in the movement in 1966. That's simply when it was popularized on the James Meredith March Against Fear.
The March Against Fear,
1960,
June 1966. Yep.
Exactly. So it was popularized there, but it had already been used for quite some time. In fact, Richard Wright, in his book Black Power, that dates to 1954. It had been used. Adam Clayton Powell. You had other people that were using the slogan. Paul Robeson used it. Jesse Gray in Harlem used it with rent strikes. So it's not new, but it was new in the movement itself. So things were changing. But you can look at the Lowndes County Freedom Organization and the organization that was being formed there, that people were organizing a power base there, as they had already did in Mississippi. The other thing is that human rights had already been there. And in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this was issued by the United Nations on December 10th, 1948.
Right.
So right after World War I ends, you have this explosion of Black freedom movements all over the world. And the Pan-African movement gained tremendous momentum. But all over the world, countries came together and formed the United Nations in 1945. That's when it was founded, right in San Francisco. But 3 years later, December 10th, 1948, the United Nations issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there were about 30 articles that were issued under this Universal Declaration. So human rights had been discussed and promoted for many years. It's just that civil rights was more prominent and dominant up until the Voting Rights Bill was passed in '65. Now, there's nothing else really to achieve in the realm of civil rights. Once the signs came down, it says whites only in hotels and motels and restaurants and public facilities. Now what? And so, in fact, you mentioned the Voting Rights Bill passed on August the 6th. 5 days later, in Watts, in LA, the brothers and sisters rose up with a rebellion to show the country that these are rights on paper that don't mean anything. So in Watts, they blew up, and now it shocked the nation. People were talking about the great progress for voting rights, and 5 days later, less than a week, it blew up in their face. And all over the country, there were rebellions. I didn't say riots, but rebellions were springing up everywhere, because it still did not change the power base. And this is why Dr. King recognized that for the second period, what Dr. King called the human rights period, there will be more extensive adjustments that white folks are going to have to make. And so while he began to challenge them more, so did the young brothers and sisters. So Black Power became the slogan. This was necessary because of the lack of confidence that too many Black folks had. You know, that most people didn't use the term Black. Most people didn't use the term Africa. They used Negro, they used colored, and but they didn't use Black until the Black Power movement made it palatable. They made it acceptable. And it was a powerful cultural movement. And even James Brown, you know, say a lot of Black and I'm proud. So that became the new identity for Black folks. And so we owe the young people, but it's not just them alone. It's also the older folks who were in the SCLC who continued to stay with the movement, and never once did Dr. King criticize them. Like, for example, the real people criticizing the young Black Power advocates, those were the civil rights leaders who refused to and could not embrace the movement in the second stage. There's two stages in the movement. First stage, civil rights, that ends in 1965. The second stage starts right at that time, late 65 and 66. And that's when you see Dr. King and others are not talking about civil rights anymore. His program is not civil rights. He barely even uses the term anymore. He's talking about human rights. So it was a shift. And if anybody stayed relevant, and 66 onward, they were embracing Black Power and human rights, and not civil rights and integration. Those people became less and less relevant. Then we saw Brown Power. We saw other groups benefit from this momentum. Now, they had longstanding grievances themselves. Native Americans, the Latino community, they also began to organize. So the Chicano, you take a look at the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, and these emerged in the mid and late 60s as a result of the powerful Black freedom movement that took on a brand new form in 66 with the Black Power movement. So it was a logical outgrowth and a dominant expression of Black freedom efforts when the civil rights effort reached its limit.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you laid out that history, because one, a lot of people don't talk about Dr. King really focusing on economic empowerment. Okay. And we don't look at the civil rights movement, then Black Power movement, human rights movement. We don't look at it chronologically. Okay. We look at it as revisionist history, so to speak. And the Black Power movement is looked at as being something separate from the civil rights movement. Okay, so very quickly, for those just tuning in, I'm speaking with Professor Manu Ampim. Professor Manu Ampim is a historian and primary researcher specializing in African and African-American history and culture. He has a master's of arts in history and African-American studies from Morgan State University. His master's thesis was the Revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr. He did that in 1989, the Revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr. And this is being expanded into a 2-volume work entitled Martin Luther King, The Evolution of a Revolutionary. I've interviewed him a few times in the past, and we've done an extensive show dealing with the revolutionary Dr. King. Okay, so talk about this for a minute. A lot of people say Dr. King started focusing on economic empowerment when he realized civil rights wasn't enough, or he realized, or he had a change of heart. I saw one documentary, I'm not going to say who said this, but Dr. King had a change of heart and then realized we need to focus on economics. But from my research, he already knew that.
Oh, he knew that. Hey, brother, let me tell you this, Brother Michael, that I've done extensive primary research on Dr. King by going to the archives around the country to look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of original documents, and also to spend time with and learn from those who were there at the time.
Right.
Like Willie Ricks, Brother Mukasa Dada, and Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Toure, to spend time with them and talk about details. So if anybody goes to the archives and look at Dr. King's press conferences, his speeches, his interviews, his sermons, the FBI files, they will recognize that Dr. King is, I argue, the most misrepresented and misunderstood figure in the history of the country. For example, whenever there was a civil rights campaign, whether it was didn't matter where it was, Albany, Birmingham,
Albany, Georgia.
It was in Albany. It didn't matter where it was, Selma. They always had an economic boycott. In other words, if a racist business did not support their movement for justice and to tear down the outrageous, humiliating whites-only signs that really represent white folks and white supremacy, there would always be an economic boycott to engage in the financial crippling of anybody who's supporting that system. Dr. King always understood the importance and the power of having an economic wing. As a matter of fact, they had an economic aspect or element of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they put Jesse Jackson in charge of that. So many people know about the Rainbow Coalition and that's an outgrowth. A lot of that's an outgrowth of the economic wing of SCLC. Right. And so they always had an economic component.
That Operation Breadbasket?
Yeah, exactly. Operation Breadbasket. Right. That was a SCLC financial program, and Jesse Jackson was leading that. But Operation Breadbasket is the birth child of the SCLC. So there's always been an economic. Here's the reality. Dr. King was not like most ministers who just sitting around talking pie in the sky stuff on Sunday. He had a political gospel, a social gospel, and he definitely had an economic gospel. So in other words, Dr. King took the ideas in the church and made them a part of his everyday reality. So economic, political, and social gospel was a part of his mission every single day. And anybody can see that from the sources, if they ever look at the sources. The problem is that he's been mummified and frozen in this concept of I had a dream. So people think that he was sitting around dreaming yet he's one of the greatest activists of his time. So people don't even know about his economic and political work. As a matter of fact, Dr. King was internationalizing the focus of the struggle long before Pan-Africanist work. For example, you take a look at the list of people who went to Ghana. When Ghana became independent in 1957, and by the way, Ghana was not the first independent African country. Sudan was in 1956. So most people have that wrong. Sudan was independent in 56. Ghana is the first country to become independent in West Africa, but that was in 57. And Dr. King went to that inauguration of Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah.
Right.
So he was there. As a matter of fact, Dr. King was focusing on the whole idea that the time had come to embrace the African liberation struggles. He started focusing on that in 57. And so in fact, he started speaking out against the war in Vietnam in 65. The reason why people don't know about that is because of the fact, guess who attacked King? It wasn't just the press. It was the civil rights leadership in the NAACP and the Urban League. They condemned King and said that he needs to stick to quote unquote Negro business in the US and not try to internationalize the struggle. And King recognized it was hard to continue to press forward with gains in this country if the movement split. So he had to kind of tone it back because of all of the internal public criticism that was being made. And then finally in 67, he actually came out against the war in Vietnam and he never turned back at that time. But you can go back to 65 and see. So he and others, they evolved out of the movement. The movement, so people misunderstand. They think that there were leaders that organized and got the movement going when in fact the movement produced these leaders. All the leaders were produced by the movement. They were produced by the movement, and then organizations were formed, and then you had great leaders that emerged to help lead those organizations that grew out of the movement. And that's what's important to know that you have. So that's what I say. You got a human rights element all the way through, and obviously King and others. It wasn't just Dr. King. Sure. Everybody had to grow. Even Malcolm had to grow. Malcolm did not understand certain things. You can look at Malcolm X in two periods.
Malcolm evolves. Yep. And Malcolm is going to, when March 26, 1964, when Malcolm X and Dr. King meet for the only time, that's a really pivotal time because that is late in the same month that Malcolm officially separates from the Nation of Islam, March 8th, 1964. And then this is right before he goes to Mecca. It is late April 64, he goes to Mecca. But you go back to July 31st, 1963, when Malcolm's still in Nation of Islam. Washington Post has an article dealing with this, how Malcolm was calling for a unification of the civil rights leaders then. This is the month before the March on Washington. And Malcolm sent a letter to the leading civil rights leaders, like the Big Six leaders, requesting a meeting with them. He was inviting them to a rally in Harlem. He was requesting a meeting with them, and he said, we have to find a common solution to a common problem posed by a common enemy. This is Malcolm while he was still in the Nation of Islam. Right. So a lot of people don't know, and this is why I said we really have to study, and what Malcolm said was he was calling for a unification of not just the civil rights leaders, but their followers also. Okay. And we really have to study both Dr. King and Malcolm X and how their ideologies are converging as they get later in life. Their ideologies are converging. So you mentioned research at the various archives. Where are some of these archives that people can go research on and read the writings of Dr. King, these primary sources?
Well, one is at Stanford. One of the newest ones at Stanford University here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's King papers there. Right. Claiborne and Carson has been the editor there. Also, another archive where I spent so much time at the, believe it or not, at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. And what's interesting about the FBI files is that to look at all of those people who were fighting for Black freedom and liberation and other groups as well, they're under the large file CIRM, Communist Influence in Racial Matters. You got that. So these white supremacists in the FBI, these racists in the FBI was so out of touch with reality, they thought that Black folks and Dr. King and others were only rising up because of outside agitators who were communists,
Right.
which was great. And then not only that, but from this file, you got to drill down now even further and look at Black nationalist hate groups. So Dr. King he was in this Black hate group category, and they thought that he was somebody who was quite dangerous. So his FBI headquarters. Another one is the Muger Collection at Boston University. He went there, he did his PhD work there. And so there's the archives there, his papers, and also there's the King Center. So when people go to the King Center in Atlanta, the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, they go downstairs and look at the video when his birthday became a national holiday. They look at a little display, his traveling materials, his briefcase, his Bible, and then they might go and get something to eat, but they don't know. They got to go upstairs to the archive. All that's fine, but go to the archives is a very different King. And by the way, the largest file that Dr. King kept was on the African liberation movement. And that's almost never written about. But these are the archives that someone must go to look at the complete record on Dr. King. And he wrote 5 books, and most people in the country have not read any of them. But guess what?
Yep.
Even if they don't read, here's another problem. Arguably the most popular speech in the country, in the history of the country, is "I Have a Dream." It's a 16-minute speech that he gave August 28, 1963. He gives the speech, and twice in this speech, Dr. King condemns police brutality. Twice.
Right, exactly.
And yet most people have not read it. They ain't heard it because they haven't been that curious to know about it. But this is why it's important to really do the firsthand or original research, because we'll then know that most of what we get is simply propaganda. Like, for example, John Lewis was great. He was definitely a great, courageous champion who stood down police and state troopers. But what we get with the passing of John Lewis is a remade historical account that's not really accurate, because John Lewis is elevated to a position as an individual that's not accurate. And most people can hear, a special on John Lewis and see what he did in Selma as he was beaten down in many different times, and not even know that John Lewis was the chairman of SNCC at the time. You don't even hear about the organization. We hear about the individual and not the organization that produced the John Lewis, nor all of the work that had been done in Alabama that made Selma even more explosive, because there was the Freedom Summer in Mississippi in '64, and the organizing in Alabama and Mississippi, and there was all kind of beatings, shootings, hangings, murders, all kind of things. People having their property taken from them because they were trying to vote. And and this was in the news on a regular and consistent basis, people being assassinated. So the public was being faced with the ugly American reality that white supremacy was entrenched in the country, as it had been from the founding in Jamestown in 1607. And Black folks were unveiling one of the most criminal aspects of the country. Dr. King said that racism is as native as the pine trees, the sagebrush, and the buffalo grass. It's so entrenched in America that it lightly burdens the conscience these days, but Black folks challenged it. And so this had been going on for months and months and months. In fact, reading 1 week's report of SNCC about an incident report in Mississippi is stunning. Just 1 week. You'll see just the killings, the murders, the attempted murders,
church burnings,
the burnings of churches, the burnings of homes, the bombings. This is why people called it, they had all kind of names for different cities. Like they never called it Birmingham. This was thing is Birmingham because of the white supremacists. The white supremacists would roll around and try to kill off or intimidate anybody they can. And so, as Brother Mukasa was saying earlier today, there's no difference. And no one saw a difference between the Democratic and the Republican Party. They were one and the same. In fact, some of the most fierce segregationists and white supremacists were Democrats. And it's amazing now that some years later, people have put the Democratic Party up there as some party of the people. Somehow no one saw it that way. And that's why you'll never find the leaders such as King and others, you'll never find them embracing Kennedy or any other politician. And matter of fact, the March on Washington, when King gives a speech in August of '63, guess what? John Kennedy, JFK, was the president of the country, and yet you have one of the greatest demonstrations for rights and freedom and jobs in the history of the country, just a stone's throw away from the White House. So how the fuck could John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, Kennedy be considered a great civil rights president when you had some of the greatest civil rights abuses and brutality in the history of the country that was recorded on film? And so the contradictions are quite obvious, and that's why you'll never find King and people in his organization embracing any of the political candidates at all. In fact, they didn't trust the Kennedy because they said these men, John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, they would only do things that were politically expedient for them and nothing more. So people, they all grew to learn really what was at the heart of the white supremacist system. And King and others were calling it white supremacy. It's not a new term. He called it white. He said, look, the struggle in Africa and the struggle here in the U.S. is the same. It's he said, it's white supremacy and the contempt for life. This is Dr. King. So when they started to organize in 1966, it was around organizing power and human rights and internationalizing the struggle. It wasn't about local civil rights anymore. So everybody had to grow and learn. And so not just one person or one organization, but we have to look at the middle of the 60s to see how the dominant aspect of the movement continued to reach a more radical position, because that was the logical outcome of facing 10 years of white supremacy and not substantial gains. You know, like Dr. King said, laws declare rights, but they don't deliver the rights.
Right.
And you have to go out and act and make the law a reality. And that's what a lot of the young activists did. They went out and confronted folks in the streets. And that's what is happening today across the country. And that's what was happening in the 1960s.
When his criticism of then the Democratic Party, you're dealing with a period of time, because I've done a whole presentation dealing with the history of why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. To understand that, you have to go back to the 1920s. And I deal with the Lily White movement in 1928, where Republicans are running Herbert Hoover to win the presidency, and they employ a Southern strategy to appeal to segregationist Democrats in 5 former Confederate states. And the Republican Party is increasingly ignoring the issues of African Americans, our fears of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and things like this. And in that 1928, that Lily White movement, that's starting to push us out of the Republican Party. And we start slowly, it's not all at one time, but we start transitioning over to the Democratic Party, not because we loved Roosevelt, but because they were more, we saw Roosevelt more responsive to our issues, still leery of the Democratic Party, but saw Roosevelt more responsive to our issues. And then by 1960, NPR, National Public Radio, has a good article dealing with this. By 1960, 2/3 of African Americans had switched over to the Democratic Party. Then 64, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, 65, Voting Rights Act. And then you're going to have this shift, the party realignment, where a lot of these Southern segregationists from the Democratic Party leave and go to the Republican Party. Not all of them, but because you're going to have a few still there, like the mouth of the White South, James Eastland of Mississippi. Yeah, he's still going to stay there. Okay, but a lot of them are going to leave and go to the Republican Party, and you're going to have some Republicans that leave. You have this party realignment that takes place. Okay, and you have people like Strom Thurmond, who was a Democrat and then switched to the Republican Party, segregationist Strom Thurmond, who ran for president back in 47, 48 as a Dixiecrat.
He was a
Okay.
senator from South Carolina. Yep.
Senator from South Carolina, ran as a Dixiecrat. And then this is about the time when you have that Confederate battle flag brought back out as a symbol of resistance to civil rights. Okay, the Confederate battle flag that a lot of people think is the Confederate flag, but it's really the Confederate battle flag in Northern Virginia and the General Robert E. Lee's army. That's on the flag that's on the Dukes of Hazzard car called the General Lee, named after a white supremacist slave owner that committed treason against the Union, and it's on the TV show. It's like the star of the show next to Boy and Luke Duke and Daisy Duke and her legs. It's like the star of the show, right? So we're watching this as a kid, man, and we don't understand. It's like, wait a second, General Lee took up arms to keep our people enslaved, So this is a whole history that's taking place within the context of the civil rights movement, then going into the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
A lot of people say Dr. King was a Republican. When I do research on this, there's no evidence of being registered as a Republican and things like this. Talk about this. Was Dr. King a Republican? That's what Alveda King said.
I doubt it. And matter of fact, he never endorsed any of the candidates. Never.
Right.
He never endorsed. He's focusing on issues, and and then those by the mid '60s, those that were the president signed that were more favorable to the civil rights movement. These were the Democrats. They had to be pushed and challenged, whether it's Kennedy,
right.
It didn't matter who it was. They can't get credit for these laws being passed, but they were more. They were a little bit more sympathetic than Republicans were. But to focus only on two parties is crazy. That's why people organize their own parties. You look at the
Lowndes County Freedom Organization. Yep.
And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in '64, they went to Atlantic City. Absolutely. So that history, brother, is important. Now, because when the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, as soon as that was passed to give Black men the right to vote, and by extension anybody else who was born or naturalized in the U.S., the white supremacists in every area, they began to erode these gains and civil rights with the 14th Amendment, and then the voting rights with the 15th Amendment. So within 3 decades, by 1900, very few Black people in the country could vote because these white folks had made it where they had the literacy test where you have to read and interpret parts of the Constitution. They had the poll tax. They had good old racism and intimidation. You would go to the polls, you're going to get your ass kicked. We're going to beat you. We may kill you. We're definitely going to take your land from you. We're going to fire you. And they did. And then they had the grandfather clause. And so the few Black people who could vote, the Black men, they voted for Republican because they were voting for the so-called party of Lincoln.
Right.
They figured that, Lincoln did a little something. I think he's overrated and he's certainly misrepresented, but he was a Republican. All of the slaveholders were Democrats. So Lincoln being a Republican, Black folks who could vote, and that number continued to dwindle and the percentage continued to dwindle, they voted Republican, as you say, all the way up until that time. And so by 1932, they helped to vote Democrat and push Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, into the presidency because Herbert Hoover didn't really say much of anything about the Great Depression. Here you got
he mishandled the Great Depression. Yep.
And he never spoke about it. He never spoke about what he was going to do about this tremendous economic depression that had taken place in a real way by October of 1929. And so Black folks decided that, you know what? Herbert Hoover, the Republican, has said nothing about this tremendous economic whirlwind. So that's when they shifted in mass to help in 1932 to help FDR. But it wasn't that just to help him, it was to help them to be able to have somebody that would help. Now
we were voting our interests. Go ahead.
So absolutely. And FDR is not somebody that was talking about Black rights, but what he did do is talk about giving a new deal to the American workers who had been given a raw deal. So so Black folks are very conservative. They're going to vote. They vote Republican from 1870 up until, and as you say, it's not just one time, one election, but the numbers are shifting.
Right.
And you notice 1928, but 1932 you have a huge shift And so from that time, you got black folks who are Democrat on in, and they don't even think twice about it. When the Democrats have been, they first of all, they were the party of the slaveholders,
Mhm.
and then you see all of these people. You mentioned James Eastland, but look at all of the other ones,
Mhm.
who were as vicious as they come. George Wallace, the president of the
Governor of
governor of
Alabama.
Alabama, yeah, is a
Mhm.
Democrat. So Democrat, Republican, and Malcolm and others broke it down. This is why King
Mhm.
and a lot of the young activists didn't go into this electoral politics hole. That's all it was a hole to get trapped in,
Mhm.
and this is why now some did. So with John Lewis and Clyburn, some people, and the Julian Bonds, a lot of them who were
Right.
active in the movement,
With
they
they were
became,
always SNCC. They were always
yeah,
SNCC.
yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. All were Smith. They went into the political arena, but then others continued to struggle for Black liberation and not simply to get into electoral politics. So what the media has done now is focusing on that narrow aspect, that legacy of some of the activists focusing on electoral politics, when you had a whole nother wing who never believed in that, and they continued to organize outside of the political arena. So even with so what I always share with people is this: to show how bankrupt the country is, and people always say this is a nation of laws. My question is the same: since when? The country has never embraced any laws. I'll take a look at the
Right.
14th Amendment.
Right.
So slavery ended not because of Lincoln. No, it ended because 186,000 Black men
Mhm.
helped fight with the North to end this vicious, anti-human, anti-Black system. So the Civil War ends in April of 65,
Mhm.
1865, that is. And then you have the Reconstruction period where you have the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. 14th Amendment in 1868 supposedly gave Black folks some basic rights in
Basic
the
right.
country, and then the 15th Amendment was passed, but the 14th and 15th Amendment weren't abided by at all. So 100 years later, the 14th Amendment was violated consistently by the country in this vicious Jim Crow system. That's why there had to be a powerful movement for civil rights, and the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964, a century later, because the 14th Amendment wasn't respected. Same thing with the Voting Rights Bill, passed in the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870.
1870.
Yeah, the right to
February
vote.
3rd, 1870, it was adopted. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So in 1965, a century later, Black folks had to fight, struggle, shed blood, and die to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. But if it was a nation of laws, they would have respected the 15th Amendment. So it's a whole century of struggle to make the country respect the amendments that had already been passed. And
Mhm.
so people can celebrate the Voting Rights Act, and it is important, but it had to be renewed every 5 years or so. And so in 2013, the Supreme Court actually they gutted. They took
Right.
one of the most important aspects of the Voting Rights Bill away. And so that's where we are now. So the phony and fake people who say that they respect the legacy of John Lewis are the ones that can care less. They don't care. They can care less about the Voting Rights Act or the right to vote because they're fine with the way it is. In other words, what happened? The Supreme Court voted 5-4.
Mhm.
5 judges, they voted that there's no more protections that are needed. So in other words, the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Bill is now is null and void. And Section 5 was protections. In other words, there was pre-clearance needed for certain states that had a history of white supremacy, vicious racism, and denying Black people the right to vote by all of these different tricks. So Section 5 required that none of these states and counties could make any changes to the voting rules and
Right.
regulations unless the federal government cleared it to make sure that it wasn't some political ploy to rob people of the vote. And so that's what it is now. In other words, states can make any changes they want, whether it's voter ID or they can change the polling place to another place. They can do any, or they can redistrict, called the gerrymandering. They can redistrict and change things so that they can split certain areas in two and to render that voting block really insignificant. If you can split a large voting block and so that they can get defeated in their new districts. There's a ways to, to really set those voting districts. And so there's been counties and states that have done that. And it's because the fifth section 5, that is
Yep.
the voting rights bill, that's been made now where states don't have to go by that. And that's why they've been able, those white supremacists who are still operating, are doing what they can to make sure that people are not allowed to vote. And so it's the same tricks that have been used for generations to either render someone's vote irrelevant if they can change the districts, or make sure that they don't vote. And that's what's been happening. Whether if someone's a felon, for example, if they served their time, they've served their time. They should be allowed to vote. Why take the vote from them? In order to reduce the number of people that might vote some of the racists and white supremacists out of office. So these tricks have been going on for quite some time, more than a century, and it continues today to try to stop people from voting and having any kind of real influence in electoral politics as voters.
Absolutely. You're referring to Shelby County versus Holder, 2013 U.S. Supreme Court case, landmark Supreme Court case. And John Lewis talked about how he felt that it was basically reversing everything, pretty most of what he fought for the Voting Rights Act. And I want to give a little historical context here. And before I give that historical context, somebody had a question here. They asked, are there any good books speaking on this breakdown on this particular topic, the changing of the realignment of the Democratic and Republican Party, any books dealing with civil rights history? What do you recommend? And I'll give a couple that I recommend also.
Are you talking about the realignment or the movement?
Both of them. Whatever you want to recommend.
Okay, well, in terms of the movement, if you want to see the change when civil rights was dominant from 1954 to 1965, and then the shift from 66 to 68, I would say there's many books you can read, but one I would share with you is A Testament of Hope. Now, A Testament of Hope is edited by James Washington, and he calls it the essential writings of Dr. King, but they're not just writings. Some of these are speeches, some are sermons. But if you look at that book, Washington, he compiles a pretty good array of primary sources on Dr. King, and you can see the shift from 65, the last year that they were focusing on civil rights, to now human rights. So I would really recommend that book. Or you can also look at James Foreman.
Who's that book by? A Testament of Hope? Who's that by?
That's edited by James Washington.
Okay.
So he's compiled Dr. King's writings from like 55 up until 68, 69, because some of it was posthumous. You take a look at Dr. King's the Black Power Defined. Take a look at his A Testament of Hope, and fire hit his lips in 66 and 67, 68. So I would recommend that. Also, I would also recommend The Making of Black Revolutionaries by James Foreman as well. Those books, you get a good idea that things change after 65. So that's one of many sources, but those are two you can see. Or you can also read Black Power by Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael as well, as you talk about Black Power in 66, 67.
Okay. So you were talking about Shelby County versus Holder, U.S. Supreme Court case from 2013 that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that dealt with the pre-clearance. And I've talked about this a number of times. And what's interesting, man, I speak across the country now. I only spoke, I think, in Chicago this year because of coronavirus, but last year, man, I think I've spoken about 13 different cities last year. But when I speak, because I do a presentation called 6 Principles of Political Self-Defense, understanding how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans. And I deal with this whole concept of political self-defense. And how politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. And how a lot of this stuff, we don't understand any of this, and all this ties into history. But when we deal with Shelby County versus Holder, that tied into the 2016 presidential election, because there were 868 fewer polling places in 2016 because of Shelby County versus Holder. Within about 24 hours after that U.S. Supreme Court decision came down, you had states started passing voter ID laws, new voter ID laws, as a voter suppression tactic, and they were trying to suppress the vote not just of African Americans, but African Americans specifically, but also Hispanics and college students, because college students usually vote more Democratic than Republican. Okay. I want to share this briefly. I've done a presentation dealing with does an amendment give you the right to vote? Because nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, even though the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote, nowhere in the U.S. Constitution does it explicitly give the right to vote. There's a difference. 15th Amendment guarantees the right. The Constitution doesn't explicitly give the right to vote. Okay, but there's a good article from history.com, official website of the History Channel. When did African Americans actually get the right to vote? When did African Americans actually get the right to vote? From January 29th, 2020. And it talks about the Reconstruction to Civil Rights era. It talks about, it lays out some of that history that you were talking about. And they said that while the 15th Amendment barred voting rights discrimination on the basis of race, it left the door open for states to determine the specific qualifications for suffrage or to be able to vote. Southern state legislatures use such qualifications, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices to disenfranchise a majority of Black voters in the decades following Reconstruction. Reconstruction ends 1877. As a result, white-dominated state legislatures consolidated control and effectively reestablished the Black codes in the form of so-called Jim Crow laws, a system of segregation that will remain in place for nearly a century. In the 1950s and 60s, securing voting rights for African Americans in the South became a central focus of the civil rights movement, while the sweeping Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally banned segregation in schools and other public places. It did little to remedy the problem of discrimination in Voting Rights Act, which is why you needed that 1965 Voting Rights Act. It goes on to say the brutal attacks by state and local law enforcement on hundreds of peaceful marches led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists in Selma, Alabama in March 1965 drew unprecedented attention to the movement for voting rights, to the movement for the Voting Rights Act, which banned literacy tests and other methods used to disenfranchise African-American voters. In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, that poll taxes, which the 24th Amendment had eliminated for federal elections in 1964, were unconstitutional for state and local elections as well. Okay, so talk about that a little bit. Then I'm gonna continue with 2012 and 2013, because Shelby County versus Holder was also a backlash to the 2012 presidential election. But talk about that passage that I just laid out a little bit, whatever you want to add to it.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's really important. So whenever there's been Black progress towards freedom and overthrowing white supremacy, there's always been the white backlash. It's always been the white racist response 100% of the time. So slavery ends, and then Reconstruction is 12 years. How are you going to solve the problem of racism and slavery over 2.5 centuries? So there's always been and the same kind of terrorism that took place in the South during the time of those who were organizing for voting rights is the same thing that took place in the South right after the Civil War ends. Mm-hmm. But the way to take away the right to vote and make it null and void was to have all of these tricks in place, because every 5 years, 7 years or so, the Voting Rights Act had to be renewed. And the Supreme Court always said, well, based on the formula that we're looking at, you have a vast number of people who are of voting age that still are not voting. So these protections are going to stay in place. And
Right.
so it's always a white backlash in a major way. But it's like whole states like Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, Alaska, and then certain counties like in Arizona, Hawaii, Idaho, North Carolina. So the whole thing is to make sure that given the history of racism and discrimination, that this wouldn't continue. But here's what: so soon as this was passed, and so as soon as the Section 5 was
Mhm.
no longer relevant. In other words, there had to be a new formula. The Democrats have said you need to come up with a new formula and actually prove that there's protections needed. Otherwise, it doesn't have to be pre-clearance. And as soon as that took place, North Carolina started with their ID requirements, and so the federal court said that these changes in North Carolina targeted potential black voters with almost, as they said, surgical precision.
Right.
Make sure that they were surgically removed from the ability to vote. And that's what we see now. Because we're on social lockdown in many parts of the country, then obviously the mail-in voting is important. This is why you have 45, the
Mhm.
one lie after another, claiming that there's going to be fraud when he votes through the mail. So does his family members. So do many other Republicans. Now all of a sudden,
Right.
there's a problem. So this is a way to try to suppress the vote, and so people have to get off their behind and do something to come up with a new formula so Section 5 is becomes a reality again. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have states that will make all kind of changes to the whole voting process. Like you said, there's less polling places. People are not even going to know where their polling places are these days. I've seen like where I live. I'm in Oakland. The
Right.
polling place is boarded up. I
Mm.
have I haven't gotten any information about where's the polling place. It's been there for years and years. It's boarded up. There's no way that's going to be used. So if somebody does want to cast a vote face to face, where they're going to do it? Because everybody's not going to do a mail-in. So everybody's not going to do the mail-in. Most people don't. Most people don't consider it, and the Republicans and other racists and white supremacists know that. So it's the same continuum to make sure that black people and others don't vote. But that's what that pre-clearance in Section 5 was really to do, is to stop the racists and others from
Right. Those former Confederate states, those states that had a history of putting in impediments in the way of us voting. Right.
yeah, no,
You had to get federal
Confederate
clearance.
states and counties and other places like Idaho, other places as
Mm-hmm.
well. So you've
Right.
got other places, Idaho, Hawaii. So and what people are arguing now is that, hey, if you take a look at what the percentage is of voters, there's no need for any protections. Everything is fine, but we know that it's not. So
Right.
John Lewis's legacy of helping, so people can talk about Selma and him being beat down by some state troopers and so forth, and voting rights, but yet the essence of what they were dealing with, they've people have been able to take that away through the Supreme Court, and so some people want to make sure that it stays that way. Don't add Section 5 back. So that's where we are now in 2020. And that's why if people saw the homegoing service, that's what Barack Obama was referring to.
That's what he was talking about. Exactly. Exactly. And in the primary elections that have taken place this year, like in Texas, especially Texas, when we saw those long lines, not all of it, but part of that had to do with polling places being shut down in African American communities, strategically shut down. Now, that wasn't the only reason. I know in some places you have a reduction in the number of poll workers because they're afraid of getting coronavirus or they may already be sick. But some of that was polling places systematically shut down, especially in African American and Hispanic communities, as part of this whole voter suppression thing. And that's a legacy of Shelby County versus Holder. So today there are approximately 17, last time I saw is approximately 1,700 fewer polling places nationwide because of that. So very quickly here, in 2012, continuing with this article that I think everybody should read, when did African Americans actually get the right to vote? This is from history.com, January 29th, 2020. It talks about Shelby County versus Holder. And it says, in 2012, turnout of Black voters exceeded that of white voters for the first time in history as in a presidential election, as 66.6% of eligible voters turned out to re-elect President Barack Obama. And there was voter suppression that took place in 2012, but we came out, okay, and it was a record number of African Americans who were registered to vote that actually voted. Now that scared the hell out of a lot of white Republicans, okay, and a lot of white people in general, but especially white Republicans. The other thing that's important to note is that white people have a negative birth rate in 26 states out of 50, as of the U.S. Census memo that came out June of 2018, and there were a lot of articles written about that. A negative birth rate in 26 states out of 50. Okay, so then Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, and in the wake of the court's decision, a number of states passed new restrictions on voting, including limiting early voting and requiring voters to show photo ID. Supporters argue such measures are designed to prevent voter fraud, while critics say they, like poll taxes and literacy tests before them, disproportionately affect poor, elderly, Black, and Latino voters. But see, a lot of us did not see the backlash to us turning out in 2012. We didn't see that backlash coming in 2013 with Shelby County versus Holder, and then didn't realize how that Supreme Court case played a part in the results of the 2016 presidential election. This is what I'm saying. We have to understand how all this is connected.
There's no question. And here's the other part of this vicious white backlash. You have Barack Obama, who's certainly better than the other presidents. He's no revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination, and he should not be compared to King, as people were doing at the time.
Right.
Lots of tremendous differences, but nevertheless, I mean, you can't get too much in terms of president. You can't get more opposite than Obama and the madman in the White House now. This madman, he's unbelievable. So this is the white response. You gotta
the backlash. Backlash through 2 terms of President Barack Obama. And a lot of us didn't see that backlash coming. If we understood Richard Nixon in 1968, who got elected, who ran on the platform of law and order in 1968, and Nixon was a backlash to the civil rights movement, backlash to the Black Power movement, a backlash to the rebellions that were taking place across the country. If we understood that, we would have seen Trump, we would have understood the backlash that Trump represented and would have stopped him.
Yeah, it was no question. It's Nixon who's riding a wave of a white conservative movement. Like, for example, now I'm here in California. So anybody that was paying attention could see that the actor, Ronald Reagan, who became the governor of California, he was a champion of the conservative movement, and he then becomes president of the U.S., president of the country. So there's always going to be a major white backlash, and that's what happened. You got a 2-term President Obama, 2008 and 12, and then you get the madman that's in there now. But that's white nationalism, which is always white. The white backlash. We're talking about white nationalism and white supremacy. That's really what that is. And so even the movement today, the counter movement has already started. And you can see, I mean, like the Philadelphia Inquirer, they made it very clear in their article. They said that buildings matter too. And then the editor, he got all kind of backlash. So there were over 40 different employees when that came out, buildings matter too, as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then they took off and they called in sick and tired. and then the editor was fired from the Philadelphia Inquirer. But anyway, buildings matter. And this is what they're concerned about. You know, and here's the other part that really needs to be looked at, brother. You notice that there's a lot of discussion about an overemphasis of nonviolence. That somebody's an activist or someone or people are part of a demonstration, and they use the word nonviolence almost more than basic words like and, but, and so forth.
Right.
Nonviolence did well. First of all, the movement in the '60s was not nonviolent
Right.
because the white folks were always violent. The white supremacists were violent. They were killers, murderers. They were lynchers. It was never nonviolent at all. And then you had black folks in increasing numbers that did pick up guns to protect themselves.
Right.
And Dr. King was a practical person, and so were the other ones. And so
Right.
they use the Deacons for defense
Defense.
as
Yep.
protection.
Mhm.
There's no question whatsoever, but it's never been nonviolent. That was simply a tactic within the demonstrations, and that's what it was. But the bottom line is, the white backlash has always been racist. It's always been very brutal, and you have a white nationalist who's in the office right now, and so this is a legacy that's here. So John Lewis, who has a great legacy of fighting and struggling, and but people can talk about Selma and Edmund Pettus Bridge. This man was the grand dragon of the KKK, and they named the
Right.
bridge after Edmund Pettus. But nevertheless, it's not the larger context that need to be understood. That John Lewis's legacy doesn't include at this moment a protection of the right to vote, and to be able to vote effectively and not have their vote neutralized. So that's really what it comes
Right.
down to, neutralizing that vote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important for people to understand Democrats in the House of Representatives passed a new Voting Rights Act to strengthen the Voting Rights Act. That passed the House of Representatives. It's stuck in the Senate, being blocked by Moscow Mitch McConnell. Call it to the Senate floor for a debate or a vote. In 2019, there were 433 bills that Democrats passed in the House of Representatives. Now, I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, but I study policy. I study history. I study policy. And I see who's passing bills in general that are more beneficial for us. And I see who's blocking those bills. Okay. 80% of the bills that Democrats passed in 2019 in the House of Representatives were blocked in the Senate. Okay. So we have to understand this. I was watching an interview, Roland Martin Unfiltered. He was interviewing Bishop William Barber III. And I share Roland's a friend of mine. I used to guest host his nationally syndicated radio show a lot in 2016. And so I shared his daily digital show. I share it live on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. But he was interviewing Reverend William Barber III a couple of weeks ago. And they were talking about legacy of John Lewis, things like this. But he talked about, Reverend William Barber III talked about an interview that was done with President Barack Obama. It may have been toward the end of his tenure, something like that. But he was asked a question: would Dr. King if Dr. King were alive when you were president, would Dr. King have supported you? And he said, no, he would have pushed me. And that's something key that a lot of us don't understand, that you hit on a few minutes ago when you talked about how during the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, especially the civil rights movement, for Democrats, we saw them as somebody who could be, as people who we could push to do the right thing. You talked about Kennedy, things like this, how they could be pushed to do the right thing. Talk about that briefly, because a lot of times in the pushing to do the right thing, that's part of that engagement that takes place after the vote takes place. A lot of times we vote and think that's the end of it. That's the end of one process, beginning of another process. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, the issue is that politicians are just that. They're politicians.
Right.
Obama's a politician. So there's many people that, voted for Obama and they were surprised and disappointed after the fact. Well, why would they be surprised or disappointed? He really doesn't change. You look at when he was a senator in Illinois. Mm-hmm. Obama voted more than 120 times. You know what his vote was? Present. What? It was present. Mm-hmm. He never voted yay. He never voted nay. He voted president, meaning I'm here, but I'm not going to cast a vote because I don't want to alienate one side or another of my my constituency or my followers. That's what a politician does. Mm-hmm. So people are not clear that politicians are in that prominent position in most cases because they're just that. They're going to do what politicians do, and that is try to keep themselves in that position. And I remember Kwame Toure when he came to Morgan State a while back in the 80s. I remember he said something. This is when I was first learning about the details of this. He said, you know, the best thing that a politician can do is not touch the money, but they're not going to be able to help the people.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best thing they can do is not touch the money, because the fact that they are a politician and have got to their point is because they're not going to take certain positions. And if you take a certain position, then you can take a certain position, but the best you're going to do is just take the position. You're not going to go very far. But if you're in prominent positions in the Democratic or any other kind of party like that, Republicans, because people are being maneuvered one way or another. But these are politicians. The bottom line is that when Black folks were most influential is when they involved themselves and created independent political parties like MBIP, the National Black Independent Political Party, that had a role, you know, really to help Jesse Jackson's campaign back in '84. But you look at that and you look at, you know, other political organizations, but if they're outside of the structure, they're going to be more influential. But people have to commit to that and know that you're not going to get very much in the mainstream political organizations. So that's what the reality is. Push somebody to do what? You already know what needs to be done, what needs to happen in order to help the people. But if you want to help the people, you're not going to get that much support. And that's what the reality is. So we do have some people that are legitimate, they mean well, but they're only going to rise so much in a mainstream party because people are not going to embrace a so-called radical position. And that's what the reality is. And so that's part of the problem, is that people have to they have to engage in politics that are sanctioned, you know, that are sanctioned and are endorsed by the white majority in those parties. Otherwise, they're not going to get very far. And that's the problem with electoral politics in the main parties, that is.
But don't you think that we have to push to get various bills passed? Get put, for instance.
Well, absolutely, no question.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. For instance, right now, African American women on average make 61 cents for every dollar the average white male makes. It takes the average African American woman 20 months to make the same amount of money that the average white male makes in 12 months. That's what Black Women's Equal Pay Day is all about. African American men, it's about 79, 80 cents. So in, I think it was July 2019, Democrats in the House of Representatives passed a bill to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. Okay. It hasn't been raised since 2010. That one bill right there, along with the Paycheck Fairness Act, but just that one bill right there. I'm not saying you're going to get rich doing this, but I'm just giving an example. That one bill right there would help a lot of African American families economically. It's not an end all to be all. You're not going to get rich. 15 is a floor, not a ceiling. In Louisiana, for instance, the average African American woman makes 47 cents on every dollar the average white man makes. And we know Louisiana has a very high poverty rate. Okay. That bill is being blocked right now in the Senate by Republicans in the Senate. So one of the things I think we have to understand and focus on is, one, whose policies are going to be most beneficial for us. One. Two, whose policies, I'm not saying be Democrat or Republican. I'm saying focus on the policies. Whose policies are going to be most beneficial? Whose policies are going to do us the least amount of harm? Who can we push the farthest and get the most from? Because our taxpayer dollars help finance all this stuff, even the policies that work against us. Okay. And who can create an environment for us to push our agendas the farthest and get the most accomplished? But then also, who will protect policies that are already in place that are beneficial to us to some degree? Because under the Trump administration, there have been at least 200 policies from the Obama administration that Trump has reversed. Okay. And then we have the attack on the Affordable Health Care Act. His Department of Justice is in court right now trying to take away the Affordable Health Care Act from like 20 million plus people. Affordable Health Care Act gave health care to 3 million non-elderly African Americans who did not already have health care. Okay, so these are just examples. All right, we need the economic empowerment, all that. It all works together, but these are just examples. Okay, comment on that for a minute. Then we're going to wrap up here in a couple minutes.
Well, yeah, I think that it's important to look at the bills and push politicians to support different bills that are going to help the community and help those that really are economically struggling long before the pandemic, because you have a disproportionate number of Black folks who are in poverty, Black children, about a third are officially in poverty. So any efforts to challenge or reverse these are very important. The problem is that when people think that's the only effort that needs to be made.
Right.
You know, so, but you know, any intelligent people are going to definitely weigh in on bills and measures and propositions that affect their local communities, and we should weigh in on any kind of statewide or countywide races, or even you know, they figure, well, the presidency don't matter. Well, it depends on what state you're in. Here in California, people are going to vote Democrat. So, and I say that, you know, so that most are going to vote Democrat. So you don't focus just on that. You can vote for Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, or write your own name in there as president. But the bottom line is you need to make sure you're voting on measures and propositions and everything else. Like where I'm at, for example, the college. It's the local voters.
Contra Costa College in which city is that in?
Yeah, Contra Costa College. It's in San Pablo. It's right by Richmond, in the Oakland area. And I've been there 14 years, and 3 times the local voters have voted for a bond measure. And that bond measure has helped to fund new buildings. Right. So I'm teaching in a new building that's retrofitted, because we do have earthquakes here. And so local voters did that. So that's important that we know what's happening around us, but people should not find that to be the only way in which they need to.
Right. It's all of it comes together. Now the president is extremely important. The reason why I say that is because the president nominates an attorney general over the Department of Justice. And these cabinet positions have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. This is why the Senate is so important. The Department of Education, Secretary of Education. And I explain to people, see, Betsy DeVos is from Michigan. Betsy DeVos and her husband, Dick DeVos, see, they led a movement here in Michigan for these charter schools, these for-profit charter schools, things like this. And they're using the charter schools to decimate the public schools. Okay. This has been going on. So here, especially here in Detroit, when she was nominated by Trump, and she's like the dumbest white woman I've ever seen. And she's totally unqualified to be Secretary of Education. If you go study that, her confirmation hearings, they expose how ignorant she was of education. If there had been one more Democratic senator, she would not be Secretary of Education, the right type. I ain't talking about like a senator. Even Senator Joe Manchin, I think, of West Virginia, voted for her, and he needs to go. But anyway, her confirmation vote was 50-50. The tiebreaker went to Mike Pence. He voted for her, so she got confirmed 51-50. But check this out. This is what happened. Mitch McConnell was in control of the Senate. Originally, Jeff Sessions from Alabama, senator from Alabama, who was nominated to be Trump's attorney general, who also cheered the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, because Shelby County's in Alabama, just so people don't know. Jeff Sessions, who was U.S. Senator from Alabama, when that U.S. Supreme Court decision came down, he cheered it, okay? Because he's a segregationist, white supremacist also. His confirmation hearing was supposed to take place before hers. Mitch McConnell can count votes. What they did was they pushed his confirmation here. They pushed his confirmation vote, I should say. They pushed his confirmation vote back the week after hers. Why? Mitch McConnell knew he only had 50 votes for Betsy DeVos. If they confirmed Jeff Sessions first, he would have been sworn in as attorney general. He couldn't vote for Betsy DeVos. So because Republicans were in control of the Senate, Senate Majority Leader controls when all the votes take place and all this stuff. They pushed Mitch McConnell's, they pushed Jeff Sessions' confirmation vote the week after hers, so he can vote for Betsy DeVos. She got in 5150, and she's decimating the Department of Education, decimating the Civil Rights Department that's in the Department of Education. But a lot of people don't understand the powers that a president has, the different departments, Department of Agriculture, Attorney General, Energy Department, Environmental Protection Agency, all this stuff. And they think it's just one person. I'm like, no, a presidential race is never about just one person. You dealing with policies and like the trajectory of the country for years. Talk about that for a minute, brother.
There's no question, it's the whole apparatus as you're referring to.
Yeah.
And, so people should always be engaged and involved. And you take a look at those activists in the 60s, they were always engaged.
Mm-hmm.
They were always engaged. They didn't respect or trust any of the politicians. They really didn't, but they were always engaged. You'll see them having meetings at the White House, being at some of the historic signings, even though they don't fully trust these individuals.
Like the signing of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
There's no question whatsoever. So they were always engaged because a person has to be engaged.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's all about balance. It's not about thinking that that's going to solve all the problems. It's not. But It's also it's the outrageous idea that one person or one presidency can solve all of the problems. As you indicated, a lot of what Obama put in place was reversed. And not only that, but the Supreme Court changes, and the Supreme Court overturns and reverses earlier decisions. So there's nothing permanent at all. But so people think that if they elect somebody, even at the mayoral level, they think the problems will be solved. Look, there were no Black mayors in any major city in the country until the late 60s, 67 or so. So this is the first time you have a Black mayor of a major city. And then you take a look at all of the Black mayors, all of a sudden, within short order, you have dozens and then eventually hundreds of Black mayors over Black cities. In those cities, you have the worst poverty in the country, in those cities with Black mayors, because people thought that was the solution, that we need to elect Black elected officials. We have the right to vote now, so let's make that vote useful, and let's elect Black elected officials, and let's change the reality in the city. The white supremacists don't allow that. It's not quite that way. So then you have one person there, and there's no one person that can change anything all by himself, but it's a whole apparatus that's in place. And you have politics at every level. So we have to be engaged, but we also have to recognize that Black folks have always been outsiders. And as the activist said, that they're the ones that open up the doors, and you get people, brother, that go in there, they get elected as individuals a lot of time, and they get their ass handed to them as individuals as well. And they don't necessarily, there's some exceptions in the House of Representatives, but you don't really have, you take a look at the Senate, you got less people, and it's more of an exclusive club. Plus you get all the perks and all of this. If you look at who can run for the Senate seat and even for presidency, now you're dealing with people that's on the other side of wealth.
Right, exactly. You take the money, yes.
Yes, you stay on the other side of wealth. You cannot run for president in a serious way unless you are a multimillionaire. Otherwise, you don't have a campaign. So the values are different. The values are different, the priorities are different, and people think they can vote and just simply go home and rest for years and years and years. And then you get people that are chipping away slowly and methodically to make sure that what appeared to be a gain has been taken away. Let's celebrate John Lewis, where they've already have taken away the strength of the Voting
Rights Act. Yep.
And
they're going to sit there and give a speech. Yep.
Look, they did it in 2013, and now people have to go back and read what was done because it wasn't all over the news. You know what I mean? It wasn't that much of it wasn't a full court press by the liberal media to present this, and there wasn't this alarm that we gotta rise up and go to the streets. That didn't really happen. So people have they rose up and they've died with electoral politics, not understanding the bigger picture is that engage, but don't be consumed with just that aspect of the work, because you'll be done in. And as soon as somebody gets taken out or voted out of office, now what you gonna do?
Right.
There's got to be a whole apparatus and an independent base of power and strength. And that's why the efforts to organize independent Black parties have had life. They've had energy and momentum, but they're not always sustained, because that really represents an independent power base that is very frightening. Those folks who look at independent power bases that are not beholden to the main parties. And so there's a lot of work to be done, to say the least. But a lot of that work that was accomplished a generation or 2 generations ago, there's much work to be done to use that work as a mattress and as a springboard to do more ongoing work to make sure that not only voting rights, but that there's the way to amass political strength and power, and not simply be under the tutelage and the domination of white political operatives that want to control the Black community. I mean, so now you get people to have a narrow choice between a madman being reelected or a Democrat who's got a shaky past. You know what I mean? And so this is really what people narrowed themselves to. And this is why the great independent political thinkers and organizers and activists, we got to look at their model and their actions to see that there's no way that intelligent community is going to be settling on 2 parties that have done Black folks wrong from the very beginning.
Right. Now, I understand that. And the other thing I think is important for us to understand is to fire the politicians who are doing us harm, especially the most harm. Both election day is opportunity to fire the people that you call in the radio shows every day complaining about, because this is what happens. This is what happened. And one thing I learned, man, I've been doing radio 10 years. I do radio here in Detroit, 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, WFDF. Thing I learned doing radio, I did nationally syndicated radio on the Ampim radio network, and then do radio here in Detroit. One thing I learned, and I've talked to elected officials as well. When white people get mad, they call their elected officials and complain. When Black people get mad, they call radio stations and radio shows and complain. Now, white people are calling the radio shows, but they put pressure on their elected officials. They'll call them, show up at their office, show up to their town hall meetings, email, write letters, they email them, all that stuff. They would do that. And if you talk to elected officials, they will tell you this. I've talked to them. They tell you this. When African Americans get mad, oftentimes we'll call them the radio shows and complain, right? But we won't put that same pressure on elected officials like other people. Okay. So we have to fire those people who are doing us harm, and run better candidates. Well, and it may mean you running as a candidate also. So that's important to understand. Okay. For those just tuning in here, I'm speaking with Professor Manu Ampim. He is a historian, and he is he teaches Africana Studies at Contra Costa College in San Pablo, California. Michael M. Hotep is the African History Network show. Also, if you all want to donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show, or through Cash App $ the AHN show, through Cash App $ the AHN show through Cash App. And then also at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And give people your how can people get in contact with them? Give them your social media information as well, Professor Manu Ampim.
Okay, I appreciate that. Yes, I teach African Studies and history, U.S. history,
yep,
and California history. Folks can reach me on social media, just my name, Manu Ampim, and that last letter in my last name is an M as a man, so don't change it to another letter. So you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and I also have a YouTube channel as well. Or you can go to manuampim.com, and you can see the work that I've been doing over the years. A lot of primary or first-hand research in Africana Studies in different countries. So not only have I traveled throughout the U.S. and North America in general, but a couple dozen countries to do original research in African culture and civilization. And you know, this period of the 50s and 60s has been one of my areas of focus as well. So social media, or you can go directly to the website, manuampim.com, and I have, you know, different publications and DVDs as well. So I appreciate it, brother, joining you again, brother Mike, to really stretch out and
absolutely.
Yes, sir.
ManuAmpim.com. Now, do you teach any online class? At one point, you had a primary research course or something you were teaching. You teach
Yes,
anything online?
I do, and yeah, I'm actually teaching a class now. It's it's a class on Black people from ancient Kush and Kemet. People know it as Egypt in
Mm-hmm.
the Bible. There's a study, brothers that study. So that's online now. It's called Brothers to Brothers. So I'm doing a 6-week class that's open to the public, and I also have a primary research training course. So if anybody wants to contact me, there's different email addresses. I'll give you the easy one. It's manuampim@gmail. And if you're interested in joining the class on Thursday nights at it's 9 p.m. Eastern time. I'm on the West Coast, so it's 6 p.m. Pacific time, 6 to about 7:30. Then you can send me an email, manuampim.com. I can give you the login information for Zoom. And we're using my book as an optional. It's not a requirement, but my book, History of African Civilizations, which I published last year.
Oh, really? You
Yeah,
have it there? Can you hold up a copy of it?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And once again, visit his website, manuampim.com, ManuAmpim. Okay, so that is a history of African civilizations.
Yeah.
And, okay, by Professor Manu Ampim. Now, I didn't even know you had that book. You put that book out. Tell us about that book.
That's last year, yeah.
2019.
And you're the African History Network guy. I didn't know you didn't know.
Yeah, maybe you posted something on Facebook, man. But you know, I see so much stuff on Facebook, and then people inbox me, man. People inbox me so much stuff every day and say, "Make this go viral." This man, so I got a filter on, man. Seriously, otherwise I can't get anything done. But go ahead, tell us about
it. I understand. So anyway, I published this last year in my company, Advancing the Research. We published it, and this is Taharqa. Taharqa is the greatest builder in the history of ancient Kush. Mm-hmm. Everywhere you see up and down the Nile valleys of fingerprints and DNA of Taharqa. So you can get this as well as $24.95, and that is my work on African civilizations. So
okay, and then you teach from that in the class that you teach on Thursdays.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the class on Thursdays, what's the name of it? What's the name of that class?
It's a Brothers to Brothers class. It's okay. That's the name of a group that's sponsoring it, but it's a history. It's really a focus on Black people in Kush and Kemet in the Bible, because that's a group that studies biblical texts, and they wanted to know more about African civilizations,
right?
Since those civilizations come up in the biblical text,
right? So you're in those regions, yeah,
exactly. So that's a class on Black people in the Bible and Kush and Kemet, and so Thursday nights it's open, so anybody could call me and I can give them the Zoom ID number. Okay,
and if they go to your website, is there information on your website about it?
Not the class, but the book. Yeah, they go to my website. If they go to manuampim.com, they can get the book, order it. But the Zoom session, I don't have the ID in front of me, but
they can email you at manuampim@gmail.com for that, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, brother. Well, look, man, I didn't even know you had the book out. So when all this COVID-19 goes away, man, you could do a book tour. We have to bring you to Detroit or something, man. You could do a book tour as well, a book signing. All right, brother. Well, look, man, it's always good talking to you. You are a wealth of knowledge. So everybody, thanks for tuning in. Share this with your friends. Follow us on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. Turn on notifications so you know when we go live. Also follow me on my YouTube channel, Michael M. Hotep, IMHOTEP, and turn on notifications so you know when we go live there as well. And we're on Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, The African History Network show. We broadcast on Facebook and YouTube, and we're on 9-10 a.m. Superstation WFDF. And all of our broadcasts are in audio podcast format also. We're on 8 different podcast platforms: iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, Stitcher, FM Player, Castbox, wherever you get your audio podcast. Search for The African History Network show. And if you go to our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, on the homepage, click on Listen to Podcasts, and it connects you to our Blog Talk Radio page. There we have over 1,000 audio podcasts going back to 2010. also some of my greatest hits with Professor Manu dealing with Deffer. You have that as well. Okay. So, because we did a broadcast dealing with that. Okay, brother. You take care. Have a good night. Okay.
You too, brother. I appreciate it. All right.
Okay. No problem. All right. Peace. Peace. Yep. All right, family. We got to get out of here. Remember, right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. And follow us. Share this with your family. Share this with your children. And we out of here.